CDC, and Hannah Conroy is also with us from the County of Simcoe to help out in the back end. So again, welcome. My name is Carol Benedetti. I work with the Aurelia Community Development Corporation, and I coordinate the professional development program. This particular webinar was organized very quickly, and I would like to thank our expert presenters who promptly jumped on board, as well as Tiffany Boning from the County of Simcoe, who I worked closely in organizing this event. The planning committee for Ask an Expert is led by the County of Simcoe, and thanks to their leadership, we were able to bring organizations throughout Simcoe County some excellent content as you all navigate through the current environment, which is ever changing, as we know. I would encourage you to keep an eye out for future webinars. In particular, I will plug the CDC's upcoming Launch and Learn, which is the changing face of business. It is a virtual event, and it's on November 16th from 1:30 to 4, and you can visit our website for further information on that. I would also like to thank our regional partners who've assisted with these webinars. Of course, that includes the County of Simcoe, but also the Small Business Center of Barrie, Simcoe County, and Aurelia, South Georgian Bay Small Business Enterprise Center, the Aurelia CDC, of course, Nottawasaga Futures, North Simcoe Community Futures Development Corporation, and the Center for Business and Economic Development. Prior to the webinar, there were some questions that were shared in advance, and hopefully our presenters are going to be able to cover the answers to most of those questions in their presentations. If you do have questions, we encourage you to put them in the chat, and you will find the chat button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation. So I feel very fortunate to have the opportunity to facilitate today's session on such an important topic. We have an excellent panel of experts for you. And I am going to start off by introducing our first expert, who is Pamela Patry, HBOR, Workplace Safety and Prevention Services. She is the acting pandemic program lead. And I will now turn it over to Pamela.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Carol. I'm pleased to be here. Am I good to start presenting, or? Great.
You're good to go. Sorry, Pam. You're good to go.
Thanks. I just need whoever's presenting to stop their screen so I can start mine. Great. Thank you. Just give me one sec while I pull up the right screen here. It's nice to be here with you all to talk about a topic that is challenging a little bit in our communities. And we want to provide you some support to understand how to navigate how to handle the controls and the hazards around COVID-19. So we've been in this for 18 months. It's not super new, but we are still learning how to navigate. So I'm pleased to be here with you today. My name is Pam Patry, and I am the Pandemic Program Lead with Workplace Safety and Prevention Services. We are a member of the health and safety system in Ontario. So there are 4 health and safety associations in Ontario, and WSPS is one of them. And we work with workplaces, the Ministry of Labor, and WSIB to help workplaces maintain and become safer workplaces within their businesses. So we like to consider ourselves system partners. If you think about the Ministry of Labor Training and Skills Development as your enforcement, they do some education as well, but they very much are the enforcement side of health and safety with a little bit of education. WSIB is your insurance side. And then I like to think of myself as the driver training side of the system. I'm here to help you. I'm here to educate. I'm here to provide you resources and support. And we are more of that education side of it. As we go through today's presentation, I just want to share with you that health and safety with regards to COVID-19 has been ever changing over the last 18 months. And so I just alert you to that knowing that today's content that we're sharing is current as of October the 6th. things change fast, and I really encourage you to make sure that you're following ontario.ca, you're checking your local public health unit for information, and you're staying up on the regulations that are specific to your business, following all of those alerts so that you're current as of the day in which you're doing it. So this may not be unfamiliar to many of you, and it's a little bit about hazard categories. So when we talk about health and safety, lately our focus has been around COVID-19, which is a biological hazard. But the rest of this hazard category wheel that you're looking at represents the other hazards that as an employer in Ontario, you need to protect your workers from to keep them safe. So, and you may see that they overlap. So with regards to chemical hazards, with COVID-19, we've increased our cleaning. We need to make sure that we are addressing chemical hazards in our workplace. We're addressing our WMIS. We're making sure our staff are trained on how to handle and use products. We're making sure our safety data sheets are up to date. Our materials are being stored and handled safely. So you can see how it's not just with regards to the one hazard, but our hazards start to overlap each other. Physical hazards might refer to temperature, vibration, noise, musculoskeletal being your push-pull movement. Some people moving to home-based offices may be experiencing pain now because of COVID-19. They're at a home-based office and they don't have a proper setup like they may have had in your business. So they do all start to overlap. Safety hazards might be slips, trips, and falls, and how they relate in your workplace. And finally, today, I'm also going to talk a little bit about psychosocial and violence and harassment concerns in the workplace. When we talk about hazards, we need to control them. As an employer, you have a duty to keep your workers safe while at work. And we often talk about a hierarchy of controls in the way that we control the hazard. So looking at this inverted upside down triangle, the most effective being at the top with elimination. If you can eliminate a hazard from your workplace, physically removing that hazard is going to be the best way to control it. And as we move down that inverted triangle with substitution, replacing the hazard with a different chemical, for example, if that's what you're substituting. Engineering controls might be the use of a plexiglass barrier. You're engineering a control to put a barrier in there to isolate the person from a hazard. Administrative controls is changing the way people work. And finally, PPE, personal protective equipment. We're going to talk a little bit about that today as well. But what I want you to think about for a minute is changing the perspective on how we control hazards. So when we look at that inverted triangle, it very much is about ending up that the tip of the triangle, PPE, is the least effective method because it relies on the worker to use the PPE, to use it properly, to be trained on it, and to make sure we're using the right equipment. Often we find that employers start with PPE. Well, we're going to use PPE and then we don't need to worry about the rest. But I want you to change your perspective a little bit and think about how you might be able to layer your controls so that they're all working together. Those little white lines might represent a gap in your control. And so if you end up with a little gap in a control, for example, with COVID-19, and something happens, then hopefully another control is going to layer on top of it and prevent COVID-19 from transmitting within your workplace. And so as we go through this bullseye approach, the colors representing the same thing that we saw in that hierarchy of controls, but we end up with the red being PPE, and hopefully that's just that final layer in order to make sure that our workers are protected. So, the COVID-19 may have sneaked through past another barrier, but we're able to protect it in the end. And so using those layers to really support making sure that we're taking care of our workers. So I'd like to talk a little bit about safety plans. These are requirements in Ontario businesses to have a safety plan that is posted and available for viewing. So every workplace in Ontario must have a safety plan. And this is under the Reopening of Ontario framework. So the flexible response to COVID-19 that came into effect this year. So you do have to have a safety plan. And they're actually kind of exciting. I know maybe my safetyness is not always everybody else's excitement, but they really helped you to drive into what are you doing to control the hazard and how can you make sure those layers that I talk about are working. So a safety plan answers a series of questions about risks in your workplace. So it's not about taking a blanket statement and saying every workplace is going to do everything the same way, because we know each of you work in a unique setting. And so you need to make sure that the controls that you're putting into place are relevant in your workplace. So you would answer a series of questions about risks in your workplace. They indicate what control measures have already been taken and what suggestions you may look at adding. And so Ontario did come out with a safety plan builder, which can be found at the link on the screen, ontario.ca/COVID safety. You can go in there and actually click on the controls and the processes that you use in your business to create this safety plan that you can then print, make available to all of your staff and hang in the workplace so that it's visible if an enforcement body came into your workplace. So please make sure if you do not have a safety plan yet, it's absolutely mandatory to have them, but also to consider going back. If you do have a safety plan, now is a really great time to evaluate the safety plan that you have and look at whether or not it's effective or if you've made changes in your workplace. So some of the components in a safety plan is communication. How are you communicating with your workers? How are you communicating the risks of COVID-19 within your workplace? How are you providing them guidance? That communication may also come into vaccines when we start talking about those in a little while. Screening is another component of your safety plan. How will you continue to screen your workers for COVID-19 symptoms? And so it's important to know that even when you are vaccinated, as an employer, you still need to ensure that your workers are screening themselves before they come to work. You want to make sure that that continues. And it's one of those things that we probably all start to have that fatigue. And yeah, I probably thought about my symptoms, but really making sure that we're taking that opportunity to actively screen and make sure that we are answering the questions related to symptoms of COVID-19 before entering the workplace. The third part of a safety plan would be preventing transmission. How will you control the risk of transmission in your workplace? So administrative controls, masking requirements, physical distance requirements, vaccinations may be a part of that. Cleaning and disinfecting may be a part of that as well. So really boiling it down to what controls do you have in your workplace, plexiglass barriers, etc. Part 4 is what will you do if there is a potential case or a suspected case of COVID-19 in your workplace? Making sure that you have the tools and resources to reach out to public health in your area to make sure you're following their direction and ensuring the rest of your staff are safe. 5 is how will you manage any new risks caused by changes to the way you operate business? So violence and harassment might be a way that has changed the way you do business. If you have plexiglass barriers, have they changed the way people can pay for things, or debit and credit machines, or are they now blocked by barriers? Is there a change in the way the system is working? So you want to reevaluate at that point. And that's part 6, is making sure your plan is working. Have you reevaluated the controls you've put into place? Are they working? For example, if you put up a plexiglass barrier and you have to step to the side of it to use the debit and credit machine, but now the customer has direct view or direct contact almost with your workers. So now your plexiglass isn't actually acting as a barrier because the person had to move to use the machine. So is that effective? And maybe there's something else that we need to do. So consider how you may need to evaluate and make changes. So In our hierarchy of controls, I talked about personal protective equipment and PPE. We've heard a lot about this over the last 18 months. And so we just want to be clear because there's been lots of maybe confusion or maybe back and forth about when is a mask required, what is PPE, what is a source control mask. So masks can be worn in two ways. It can be worn as a source control mask. This is workers and visitors who wear the mask to protect those around them. The mask is controlling the hazard at the source. So it's really protecting the COVID-19 maybe from a person who is asymptomatic and doesn't realize that they have it when they're out in the community. These would be the cloth masks maybe that you have sewn at home, and they act as a source control mask. The second way that people can wear masks is as personal protective equipment, or PPE. Workers wear this mask along with eye protection to protect themselves. So it's important to know that not all masks are suitable for both purposes. With regards to PPE, the mask should be a surgical or a procedure mask along with eye protection. So I do stress those two components. Masks are especially important indoors to help reduce the risk in situations where physical distancing and other control measures can't be consistently maintained. So that's when we want to make sure that those masks are there to create the barrier. An exposure of a worker to an unmasked person with COVID-19 within 2 meters for more than a transient amount of time is considered high risk, unless the worker is wearing PPE. So again, that PPE is a surgical or face mask, procedure mask, along with eye protection. And those two go hand in hand together in order to be PPE. If you're going to be within 2 meters of an unmasked or improperly masked individual or inconsistently masked individual, you need to ensure your staff are wearing PPE. There's some really great sources there at the bottom from ontario.ca using masks in your workplace. And WSPS has a article on new COVID eye protection requirements and what you need to know. So if you need more information about this specific topic, what is eye protection? How do I use it in my workplace? That article there can support you. And absolutely, I am able to do that as well. So again, some new clarities that we're having for workers, and again, specifically today, I am talking about workers, is a fully vaccinated worker, so at least 14 days after their second dose, is not normally required to self-isolate after a high-risk exposure. So if you remember back to my previous slide, I said a high-risk exposure is if you come in contact within that 2 meters, not wearing PPE of an individual who may have COVID. So they're not normally required to self-isolate if you have your 2 doses and 14 days, but really it's important to follow public health guidelines. Contact your local health unit, follow their instructions about what your workplace now needs to do with regards to it. So this only applies if that worker is asymptomatic. The worker can return to the workplace. They must wear a mask. They must maintain physical distancing when outside of the home, including at the workplace. So, you really want to consider contacting your local health unit, making that part of your safety plan. How are we going to contact them? Who is our contact? And what information are we looking to follow? So as an employer, we can follow those directions. So today we said we were going to talk about vaccine policies, and I'm going to talk a little bit about vaccine policies in the relationship to your workplaces and workers. And then Deborah is going to talk to you a little bit more about some samples and other supports. So we highly recommend workplaces develop a vaccination policy for your workplace. The Ontario government did come out with guidelines around a vaccination passport system for specific industries and your patrons and customers accessing or coming into your facilities. That passport system or that requirement does not translate or translate over to your workers. That really is about your customers coming onto your site, and that is under the Reopening of Ontario Act. So businesses need to verify that individuals are fully vaccinated plus 14 days in those specific industries that were identified. So workers are governed under different legislation. And so I often am asked, well, why can I go to a restaurant and I have to be vaccinated, but my server might not be? And the reason is they're governed under different legislation. As an employer, it is your job to protect your workers under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and it requires businesses to take every reasonable precaution to protect the workers against workplace hazards. COVID-19, as I identified at the beginning, is a workplace hazard, and you have a duty to protect your workers against hazards like COVID-19. So by having a COVID-19 safety plan, you are starting to meet the requirements of a business. Under the plan, you then are including information about physical distancing, masks, eye protection, barriers, ventilation, cleaning and sanitizing, screening, and more. And those are the components that you're using to protect your workers. And your workers aren't removing their masks as well with your customers, whereas in those high risk industries that were identified, often those patrons and customers are removing their masks. So those would be some of the reasons that workers are governed under a different legislation, and the vaccine passport system isn't related to them. But we do encourage you to create a policy of some sort. So some workplaces are addressing your legal obligation under the Act by developing a voluntary or a mandatory workplace vaccination policy. And we really encourage you, if you are doing that, to seek legal advice or HR advice when you are developing your vaccination policy. You need to consider legal issues, health and safety, human rights, privacy, employment and labor relation laws. Things that you might want to consider including in your vaccination policy. What steps are you taking to reduce workplace transmission? Using the information from your safety plan and putting it into that policy. Reviewing how are you planning? Are you planning to use rapid testing, and what other controls like screening will continue even after vaccination? Why are you implementing this policy? Who does the policy apply to? Workers, contractors, customers, deliverers? Who does your policy apply to? You might include things like the benefits of vaccinations and how your workplace is going to encourage and support workers to become vaccinated, like giving them up to 3 days paid leave to be vaccinated or to recover from side effects. Those sorts of things to include in your policy. And then finally, consider in that policy, what will you do with the information? How will you obtain confirmation? Where will you store that information? And how will you make sure that any information is kept personal, confidential, and secure? And again, there's a source there from the ontario.ca with regards to vaccinations. And finally, before I hand it back over, I just want to address violence and harassment considerations. So it is a legal requirement under the Occupational Health and Safety Act for all workplaces to have a violence and harassment policy. So you need to address violence and harassment in your workplace. Harassment won't be tolerated, and then what steps that you're going to take to support your workers. And that's considering worker to worker, as well as worker to customer or patron, and vice versa. So, really making sure that your program exists, reviewing the policy and the procedures with all staff to make sure that they're aware that it exists, and helping them to identify unwanted behavior from coworkers or from customers, and that you have that duty to protect them from harassment under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. WSPS has many resources that can help you in violence and harassment, but really you need to consider, how will you de-escalate irate customers? How will you work with empathy to support the customers and your staff who are dealing with more challenging situations by having to check vaccination passports potentially, or having people who are more frustrated in the workplace? So how will you de-escalate it? Are there courses and resources that you can provide to your staff? Might be things to consider in order to help them. Maybe avoiding working alone and having somebody else up at the front of the house or in the business, so that individuals aren't by themselves working with people with concerns. So I encourage you to consider that, and we can talk more about it later in the presentation if there's questions. So Carol, I am going to send it back over to you. when I figure out how to stop sharing.
Okay, thank you, Pamela. As always, tons of information. And just as Pamela figures out how to get her screen, I just want to mention that we also have Kevin Shelley here from the Ministry of Labor, Trades and Skills Development. And he is the Regional Program Coordinator for the Newmarket office covering York Region and Simcoe Region. Kevin is going to be representing the position of the Ministry of Labor during our Q&A session. And maybe I just invite Kevin to just sort of show us his face and give us a hello.
Hi, good, I guess afternoon, everyone.
Perfect. So we'll be hearing from Kevin a little bit later during the Q&A, but now I'm going to be turning it over to Deborah Jocelyn, who is the CEO and Presidentess of Next Gen Hub Inc., Safety, Training, and Consulting Services Limited here in Aurelia. Deborah is an entrepreneur, an HR and safety specialist, a business developer and coach. And Deborah can actually explain herself what she's going to be presenting on today. So Deborah, it's all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present to each of you. And also, again, thank you to the CDC, to the county, and to all of those who have supported the presentation, and as well, Kevin and Pamela. It's great to join you in this particular information session. I have a little bit of a different approach from field experience and being an entrepreneur and dealing with the day-to-day issues around vaccines and all of the safety precautions that are required by businesses. So some of I see with the presentation with Pamela will have a little bit of an overlap, but I'll look at the other side with you today to see if we can help guide you. And we also have a template that can be used as a guideline for you in your businesses. If you'd like that at the end of the session, I believe information is going to be sent out so that you'll have that to use again as a guideline. Okay, so we'll just get our presentation going here. Okay, so again, the focus being vaccines in the workplace and taking the steps towards how do we address and deal with this when there's ever-changing information. I know as a business owner myself, there are times that can be very challenging to try and go through all of the information when we're out doing worksite inspections for pre-Ministry of Labor inspections and helping business owners in all different aspects make sure that they're meeting compliance while still being able to operate and have a profitable business is all part of the components that I know that we are all taking into consideration as we move forward through this pandemic, which of course none of us ever expected to be in, expected to be as long as it has been, but we're in it. So we're needing to address it as we move forward. So as of September 22nd, as you know, Ontarians will need to be fully vaccinated, 2 doses, 14 days with proof of vaccination or ID to go into specific indoor public settings. Also, Ontario plans to develop and implement an enhanced digital vaccine certificate with a unique QR quick response code. That's been all over the news, out in the information. So just a little bit of a synopsis. Again, now, does your workplace fall into this? And how do we handle this as an entrepreneur, as a business owner? And how do we address the different aspects of our workers? So initial suggestions and recommendations that we look to when we're helping a company build policies and procedures and going through the steps is the one thing is that no one can be everywhere. So we do have a duty to our employees to ensure that we provide a safe work environment. We need to do everything reasonably known to us. So we have an internal responsibility system, as many of you would know through your training. And information that you can also access. But we have an internal responsibility system to our team, to our company. And I know most of us as entrepreneurs, without that internal responsibility system, wanting everyone to go home safely, wanting everyone to be free from COVID, wanting everyone to recover, it's really important to do your investigation to find out everything that you can, and then you make reasonably known decisions. And also that obviously follow the guidelines of your employment standards, your human rights code, and the Ministry of Labor guidelines. So again, those are three areas where when I speak about being a specialist, I've been in business since 2000. I came as an entrepreneur out of my own, and going through the different segments, knowing that safety was going to be strong, HR were going to have diverse needs, but also being a business owner myself and ciphering through it. So have a little different approach, but we follow the guidelines. And I would have to say I'm pretty adept at all guidelines that would deal with all human resources and all safety compliance. Yes, I do sleep at night, but it doesn't, it's not always a sound sleep when especially with COVID and entrepreneurs and business owners texting me and reaching out to my team for help. The other thing is that we're a team. As an employee group, we're a team. So we need to be able to communicate, and we need to figure out our teamwork. That can come through your joint health and safety committee or your safety rep, asking them for information, going out and having conversations with your team. For bigger organizations, it might be a survey, or it may be a Q&A or a presentation like this where you're getting feedback. Is it always going to be the feedback that you want? No, but again, you're doing your due diligence to see what the majority of your own environment is feeling like, what it's like in your own environment. And the next piece is we always recommend due diligence best practices. So again, I always seek legal counsel and legal advice when there's anything that I'm presenting or offering as a suggestion or information, because I want to be sure that we're providing the right information. And I'm always looking at the other side of, well, the what if. As a business owner, how could this affect me? I don't want anyone to come back on me if I was to terminate them for a reason. I don't want that to happen to another employer. Again, anyone can do anything in this world. We know, but we want to be in a good position to have done everything reasonably known to us to protect ourselves and follow the legislation, guidelines, and so on that are being put out, particularly around vaccines at this moment, given that this is our topic. So the first thing to do is to look at a risk assessment. Every business is unique. And what I find working with trades right through to medical environments, off to restaurants and all different types, and ourselves as an entrepreneur business. We are not government funded in any way. So everything we do and make is part of what we do as a business. So we all have to look at it differently. And what I find is that businesses have their own uniqueness. They might serve several similar things, provide a similar service, but you're still unique. So you want to look at how are you acquisitioning contracts, or how are you drawing in your customers or your clients? So those are factors you want to think about. How could it affect them? Put yourself in their position. Make sure that you control the number of, or how many workers do you have on site in the workplace at any given time? How can you adjust that if possible? If there's spacing issues where workers cannot maintain 2 meters distancing, again, Pamela mentioned there's extra PPE that's required. Masks and workers and customers and others entering the workplace. So when you go through that risk, look at broad what you could do as your risk assessment with all of these different areas. And again, I'm just putting some points in for consideration. Then we're going to go through how do we identify and deal with it. So work-related travel and accommodations, carpooling, etc. Poor ventilation in the workplace. Can that be addressed? What is reasonable that we can do? Immunocompromised workers or customers or patrons. Again, it's private information. So how do we find that out and then not affect someone's privacy? So that's all of these things that are so difficult sometimes to find, but there are ways to allow people the opportunity, as long as we're protecting their privacy, to share what we need to know to help protect them. Also, remote virtual work is not always applicable for the job duties. For instance, I was out on a job site in Collingwood 2 days ago doing an inspection. They can't really build that condominium from home. So pretty standard, but also just thinking of what that means in your job duties and can you make any adjustments? Others can certainly make those adjustments, which is great. And then what is your overall culture of your workplace? That would probably have already been established prior to any pandemic. So if your overall culture is one of more openness, one of more inclusivity, one of a happier workplace, it's going to break down some of the barriers and some of the challenges where people aren't able to focus, don't always follow guidelines, all of those things. So having a look at your actual culture will also really help with these risk factors to go through the next step of building a proper policy and procedure. So rather than just downloading something and then just filling everything in, again, think about these things because it belongs to you as your individual organization. So as Pamela did, going through the hierarchy of controls is something that we always do when we're looking at building a policy about something that we may not have had exposure to in the past. So we look at, can we eliminate it? Yes or no? If we can, that would be great to eliminate COVID, but of course it's no. Substitute, can we replace the hazard? Well, not so far. No one in our means across the world has been able to do that at this point. Maybe that will change later. Engineering controls, as Pamela spoke to as well, those come with barriers so that we're changing the way people work so that we are putting different things that in place. So those typically deal with equipment, any kind of areas for isolation. So we have to think about that in our policy and add that in. And then what we're really focusing on, or at least I'm focusing on today, is the administrative control, which is policy and procedure. So those become signage, policies, procedures, ways of making change, developing that culture, and then PPE. And again, as Pamela had also mentioned, PPE is at the bottom end of the funnel. But if we are able to actually go through the hierarchy of controls and eliminate or substitute, engineer, or do some administrative control, sometimes we have less PPE to deal with as well. But again, we don't want to say that it's not important. This is very important because sometimes you only have PPE to address. You can't deal with the other situations because it's just not effective in the situation you're dealing with. So the way we look at things is there's always a way around it somehow. So I guess it's that entrepreneurial spirit comes out, is that we either jump through it, over it, under it, somehow. We need to find a way to address dealing with our workers in the workplace and also dealing with ourselves as leaders in our industry. So employer and employee responsibilities in a nutshell would be employers are to keep an open mind and be non-judgmental. I've experienced now dealing with employers that I'd rather quit my business than have to have my team get vaccinated. I have other employers saying, well, I don't want to hire anyone if they're not vaccinated. How do I deal with that? So there's so many opinions coming out, but we just need to keep an open mind and do our best to separate ourselves from this is our business and that's the situation. And we want to take in information from people so that we are again gathering all the information to make reasonable, sound decisions. Do everything reasonable to keep workers and workplaces safe and free of health hazards. Again, that culture will really help if you engage your team as part of that. You don't want to suggest something that they do, have your policy procedure. They're like, yes, yes, and half sign off. And then all of a sudden you go turn around and then they're not following. So again, there's no way to 100% stop that from happening that I have found or experienced. But again, you're doing your due diligence. So if anything happens, you have a way of going back or reaching out to the Ministry of Labor and asking questions, reaching out to WSIB. Those are resources there as well to help us when they can. Understand your health and safety rights and responsibilities as an owner. We all have them. It's been around a while. I'm finding that the pushback on this is much less than before. Know where you sit. Very, very important. Keep updated with your public health authorities and governing bodies. So again, regarding the risks of COVID-19 and any related documents such as your COVID safety plan. So make sure that you have that in play and that you're good to go. And there are some good resources out there for the COVID safety plan from the government that you can use as a fill-in and put your information together. And then communicate while maintaining privacy. So that has not changed. So again, before COVID or any of these things, this was still all what was required. Just some people are more new to having to implement safety because we feel like we're pressured to because of the pandemic. So, but again, this is not new. It's just a new situation and a very challenging and very volatile situation as we all feel, and that we don't want anyone to get sick for sure. So the employee to communicate with the employer and provide information as required within their rights. So if they offer the information and they're comfortable with that, then we need to store that and use that privately. But we can't force them to give us personal information, just like they couldn't force us to give information to them that was private to us about our health or other risks. Refuse unsafe work and report it immediately to the supervisor. That's their job. Understand and follow the employer's workplace health and safety requirements. Follow direction for public health officials and governing bodies. That's the duty. There is a duty and a due diligence side for the employee and the employer. Report any circumstances in the workplace that is likely to be hazardous to their health or others, and that includes any potential exposure to the pandemic. Any known exposure needs to be reported so that we can put our different measures in place and best practices to work for us and our team. So the policy. So we suggest, and again, this is a guideline. I have consulted with my employer, I always do, but this is a guideline to help you and what you should consider when you're doing a policy. So what is the purpose? So we know there's a purpose, and here we know there's a purpose to have this. But if there is no purpose, we don't need a policy. So that's one way to ask that question of yourself. The other part is, what is the framework that you're going to go through to build this policy? And then what are the best practices and expectations? So how you're going to build that. And then what are the implications if a team member doesn't follow through? So the purpose, for an example, so this is what's going to come to you, anyone that wants the template, what I'm going through in this information would be the wording that would be in the policy that you're able to use around your own business, but to give you a start and a guideline. So basically you want to outline expectations regarding COVID-19 immunization for all workplace team members. So you'll need to sit down and think about, one, are you mandated through governing bodies to ensure everyone is vaccinated? What is your choice and what's your business, and how you're going to look at that with your risk assessment? So again, it would read like this in your policy: the health and safety of our workplace team continues to be a key priority, which includes a commitment to taking all reasonable precautions to protect health and safety of our team during the pandemic. It has been reported that vaccines are an effective way to protect individuals and their coworkers from COVID-19. Dependent upon availability of the vaccine and or unless qualified medical exemptions of COVID-19 vaccinations are provided. Framework. As an employer, we have duties and responsibilities under the Occupational Health and Safety Act to take every reasonable precaution to protect workers' safety and to assess the workplace for risks which include COVID-19 transmission. The Ontario Human Rights Code and other legislation, including the Personal Health Information Protection Act, and informing health officials if a COVID-19 or variant case within the workplace occurs in order to protect other employees, their families, and the general public. So in our policy, we're asking if someone has been exposed, we need to know so that we can do our duty as an employer to let health officials know so that we can do our best to protect those in the public. Employees are encouraged to reach out to the supervisor or human resources for further information and resources. So open up the door, open up the dialogue. Workers may be required to undertake regular rapid antigen testing in the workplace. So if you put this in, not everyone's going to want this, but again, it's something that you may want to consider when you do your homework, and maybe do a periodic. So it's going through your steps. Already experienced, there may be changes to legislation because we've already experienced the number of changes to that and public health authorities as the pandemic evolves, and the purpose requires are outlined in the policy. Guidelines which turn and change may be required for changes in the policy. Changes will be communicated through any of the following means. So you're saying how you're going to communicate it: an announcement and notice, an email or text, posted signage, and a due diligence process, which would be training and signing off through due diligence. Whether you do that internally or you have that outsourced, it's up to you. All workers' vaccine information will be protected in accordance with applicable privacy legislation, including maintaining these records in a separate file. So there is review to make sure that this is kept in a separate file. So if someone chose not to be vaccinated and how you're going to handle that, you don't want that to be part of the regular HR file. Again, we want to be non-judgmental. We want to be able to offer the opportunity. We want to encourage vaccinations. We want to encourage that in our workplace, but we want to make sure that we have that separate also if we were to destroy that in the future, so that it's not going to be part of our HR file necessarily. Education and information regarding the benefits of vaccines. So regardless of our belief, we need to make sure that we provide that to our team members so that they have the opportunity to be well informed. which will include the benefits, the risks, the side effects, and so on. And again, there's a plethora of information out there. Addressing it with your local health unit is often one of the very best resources. But again, there's lots of information, as we all know. I'm sure you've all been on looking at different information to try and educate yourselves. Best practices and expectations. So with this respect to this policy, I would suggest that you put it as a best practice. It's not a black and white, as we know, like wear your hard hat, like wear your gloves, like mask. It's so much easier for a black and white. You either are doing it and following along or you're not. This is going to be the best practices for this situation. So all workers, an example, would be required to provide one of the following by a date. So you might say, okay, by November 30th, I would like this from my team. Proof of receiving fully approved Health Canada vaccine, 2 doses plus 14 days post the second vaccine dose. Proof of vaccine administered or the scheduled date that they have for their second dose. A written medical note by a doctor or nurse practitioner to indicate that there is a medical reason to be exempt from the vaccine. So we don't need to know the reason, that's private. The medical note would come from them to say that myself, Deborah, I'm unable to, for a medical reason, have the vaccine. And in that note, it should indicate the period of time. Is it just because I've recently had surgery, I'm immunocompromised for a temporary period of time, or more permanent? So that needs to be inside the doctor's note as well when you're asking for that. Implications. So in all policies, procedures, and best practices, we need to say that we're going to do something. If we don't follow through with that, we set precedents to not do anything. So one of the things that's very important, because I get the other side of this often to help with the termination or with human rights issues or with Ministry of Labor or WSIB, and it's filed. These are the things I deal with on the back end for our clients and people coming in. So sometimes they don't have an implication. It's like, okay, we need to do it. But then if we don't, what happens? So the implication would be, for an example, with the exception of a medical exemption, any worker not adhering to company safety policies, procedures, protocols, and best practices may face disciplinary actions such as, but not limited to, maybe a change of hours, work duties, layoffs without pay, or termination of employment. Note, every reasonable effort will be considered in a case-by-case situation with respect to this and all company-related policies. Management reserves the right to determine any accommodations for workers, whether they are vaccinated or not. So again, you're looking at a case-by-case, but you're putting it in writing, you're communicating that, you're showing your support, you're showing that you're non-judgmental, and that you're wanting to make sure that they get the information, and the information shows us that people that are vaccinated are helping us in our workplace to prevent the spread of the pandemic. Here are some links that we'll provide in our presentation. Again, Pamela may have a lot of the same links for you, which is great. But some areas that we really look at is, again, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the rapid testing, Bill 284 regarding putting workers first, COVID-19 and your employment standard and protection. And then again, your policy and COVID statement mandates and proof of vaccine certificates and how that's going to be placed out. And then any type of kind of Q&A is available as well. So when you're looking at a policy and you're looking to make that decision, once you assign your risk, you look at your hazards, you look at your industry to see, are you mandated or not? And then you're making the decision based on your risks and your hazards to put those controls in place. And one of those controls, as we saw, was administration, which is a policy. And then if you aren't going to adopt this, then my recommendation from experience only is that you're going to have to enforce the PPE, your barriers, all of your conditions in order to do everything reasonably known to you to prevent the spread of the pandemic. So I really hope this helps and the information, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share information.
Great, thank you, Deborah. So we are going to go into Q&A now, and there's been some questions that have been put in the chat. I see that one person asked about compensation for employees. I don't know if somebody could maybe just expand on that when we mentioned about allowing the 3 days off compensated in order to get vaccinated and recover. Pam, could you maybe clarify where more information on that is available or clarify that?
So I think that I put a link into the chat for everybody, and we will include it in our resources. It is paid through WSIB and the information is available, but we'll definitely make sure that in the responses that go out, all of these links will be included.
Yes, and if I could just speak to that as well, make sure that there's really good documentation. So make sure that you have everything well documented, and any kind of investigation or anything is done to support the information that will be provided to WSIB for the reimbursement of the 3 days.
So I'm just going through the questions that were submitted ahead of time just to see if there are some that possibly weren't. We've got one here asking how to deal with rude customers. So I'm assuming that that might be a situation where, you know, somebody comes and they want to be served or be seated and they don't have their vaccine certificate. Your policy says that they need to have it. What are some things that can be implemented in the workplace to make that manageable?
So maybe I'll take it first, and then Deborah can follow up. But I think that it's really important with that empathy point of view. I went to a restaurant the other day and I had my vaccine certificate, but I forgot my ID. And so the worker said I need it. I was like, yes, you absolutely do. So I had the choice to go out to my car where my ID was and be considerate and understanding for that worker. I could have put up a big fuss that, well, I have my certificate and just let me in, or I could eat outside because dining outdoors, you don't require it. So, I think that we just have to have that empathetic approach. I just forgot. It's new for all of us, and so as patrons and customers, we have to do our best to remember. And as employees, we also need to remember that while sometimes people are frustrated with the process, sometimes they just forgot. And so really being supportive and understanding, but these aren't your rules. They're the rules that you're enforcing. And so, having that system in place and having somebody there to back you up if a customer does become irate, and if it becomes a dangerous situation, contacting the local authorities, calling 911 is acceptable if the customer is irate and it's a dangerous situation, so that you can get the support that you need in a timely fashion.
No, I think that's great. Thanks, Pamela. And a couple of things I would just like to add to that as well is that I've also experienced that actually most recently, where someone in a restaurant was asking, the staff was asking for one of the clients to provide information on the vaccine information details, and he was just so belligerent. It was really, I felt disheartened for the team member that was standing there in front of them. And so what I would say when through business coaching, again, this is my experience and how I teach. I'm not saying everyone's going to do this, but there is never a time when that is necessary behavior. So in our environment, again, you're going to have empathy. You know that we're all have different stresses. We have so much going on. But then when you deal with violence and harassment in the workplace, it's never acceptable. It's just not. So that would be where, maybe a manager needs to be contacted if it's not escalated to the time for having the police contacted, but certainly absolutely can escalate to that. But also making sure that you address it as a supervisor, that the employee is able to come to you and let you know if you're not there, and that you address it and you back them up. Really important to back up your team and support them during this time. And one thing that I often use, and again, just sharing it with you, is I say to people and I have this because sometimes they think I'm the safety police and I'm not, is that I go, I don't give you permission to speak with me that way. And sometimes it makes them step back, because I think that's something that needs to be really addressed, is that there's never time for that behavior if it's something that's dealing with mental health issues and things like that, for sure. But again, we really need to be backing each other and helping each other in this particular situation. So agree, Pamela, and I'm sure you've all experienced something.
You're muted, Carol.
Oh, yeah, I know. Thank you. there's a question here, and it says an organization has a plan in place, very similar to the ones that the feds announced today. No proof required, just attestation. And again, I mean, here we go. It's just announced today, right? Everything's always changing. But they say if they move to a proof basis and will not be able to accommodate QR code scanning, what happens if the patron only has a QR code, but not the paper certificate? Does anyone know the answer to that?
So I think what's interesting about that is originally, I think we all thought that there would be an app for all of us. We would download this app and away we would go. But the app is for the businesses to be able to scan the QR code. So as patrons and customers, we're going to download a new certificate that will have a QR code on it. So just like right now, you saved your receipt to your phone or your device, and that's how you have it on your mobile device. You've downloaded the receipt. You're just going to do it again. And there'll be another section with this QR code that will then be able to be scanned. So either as a business, you can either scan that QR code or accept the receipts that exist today. So the ones that you're looking at today that has the date and the 2 doses will continue to be acceptable. And I think we'll know more as the government comes out with the application for scanning as well.
So if nobody has anything else to add to that, I'll just move on to the next question. How do you handle an employee who doesn't believe in the effectiveness of the vaccine and refuses to be vaccinated? That's a very common question, and I know that you guys probably hear this all the time. So I don't know who would like to take it first.
Deborah, would you like to?
No one wants to touch that subject, so I'll give it a shot here. So again, we have to be really open-minded and non-judgmental with that. So fairness across the board. So one of the good things about having a policy and procedure in place is that you can always go back to the policy and procedure. Company policy and procedure is. So it removes you from actually being in the person to the policy, which yes, you've built it, but it gives a guideline. How to address that, we have to be in a position, again, now this is what I've received from legal counsel, is that if you did have to terminate someone, you couldn't accommodate them, you've adopted that if it was, unless it was for medical reasons, then, I mean, anyone can do anything. Anyone can sue anyone, we know that. But if you document, you've done your due diligence, you've done everything reasonably responsibilities wise when it comes to addressing the hazards and following the Ministry of Labor Employment Standards Act and everything, you've done everything reasonable there. There's a very good chance that you're going to maybe have some challenges with it, but that you should come out okay with it.
Thanks, Deborah. I know we've asked this question a couple of times, but it's been asked again. If we could just clarify how the 3 days off to be reimbursed, is it through WSIB? How does that work? How does an employer allow their employee those 3 days off to get vaccinated?
Sorry, did you want me to speak to that?
Yeah, go ahead. I was muted there, but go ahead.
Okay, not a problem. So yes, so it is through WSIB. So we do need to do our reporting, and all the information is available through the WSIB website. So documenting, put everything in, and then you send it off to WSIB. They'll require proof of information so that employee is actually off for that reason, of course, and you'll be looking for that as well. And then you submit it, and then it's reimbursed directly from WSIB to the employer.
Perfect. Did you have anything to add to that, Pam, or is that?
No, I think that's great. And ontario.ca, there is a page. We'll make sure it's in the links that has information about how to compensate and the steps to follow.
Okay. I feel like most of the questions that were submitted ahead of time that can be answered have been answered.
Carol, I saw one that we didn't talk a lot about, and that's
Sure.
antigen testing, rapid testing. So,
Yes.
Deborah did talk about, that being an option, depending on how you determine your policy. I just want to clarify that rapid antigen testing is not meant for a fully vaccinated individual. It's meant for the unvaccinated individuals, and it is not meant for symptomatic people with COVID symptoms. It is really for asymptomatic testing, and there's a program through the government that you can get access to rapid antigen tests that you can then deploy into your workplace. And there's steps that are required with them. Reporting, results, would go along with that. So, those are options, but you need to make sure that you look into them completely and understand what the purpose of a rapid antigen test for. It's for an asymptomatic individual who is not vaccinated in your workplace. Again, making it into your policies so that it's across the board, it's universal, it's non-judgmental, like Deborah talked about. I think that those are some really great languages to make sure that you understand that we're applying the policy to everybody across the organization based on your individual status.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to consult with my team who's been looking at the chat and see if there's anything in there that they can identify that we haven't addressed.
Hey, folks. I figured I might as well jump in now, seeing how my two colleagues have been fantastic in preparing the information. Here's what I want to talk about. So from a Ministry of Labor perspective, if you get inspected, the Ministry of Labor inspector will look at all the aspects that both Deborah and Pamela talked about: screening, masks, policies, procedures, ask you questions around that. The one thing I want to two things really is the vaccination certificate, the Ministry of Labor won't touch. So we won't, if we go in under the Occupational Health and Safety Act into a restaurant, a gym or whatever, we may ask that you're doing it, but we won't verify, right? So my inspectors will not go up to a patron and say, did Kevin over there verify that you proved your vaccination? They won't do that. They'll ask the employer if they're doing it. If the employer indicates yes, then from our perspective, we're okay that you're following that part of the ROA plan. Vaccination policies. One thing I want to be clear from the Ministry of Labor's perspective, the Occupational Health and Safety Act does not address vaccinations or vaccination policies. So an inspector may come in and ask you if you have developed one or have one. And again, if you indicate that you have, they may ask to review it just to see that you have it. So you're not lying to us, not that you would, but as far as the content of it, how it's applied and how it's delivered to your workers, I'm in full support of what Deborah was talking about and Pamela about how you develop it, where you develop it, and those kinds of things. So just what I'm trying to do is assuage your fears that the Ministry of Labor is going to come in, and if you don't have these things, we're going to come in with a big stick and start fining and prosecuting you. Our directive for now is similar to the WSPS and Deborah's organization. We're here to help and educate, provide resources, guidance, and materials to help get you guys in those sectors to the point where it's self-sufficient so you guys can be able to do it. With that being said, I want you to know that from the Ministry of Labor's perspective and most enforcement agencies, the direction has been, it's kind of a cliche, but all hands on deck. So I can tell you that the Ministry of Labor has a program called a multi-ministry team. So any ministerial agency that is a provincial offenses agency will put together a program where their officers on certain days, which will be announced through WSPS and other organizations. So for example, this past weekend in Peel Region, we did a multi-ministry team blitz initiative, whatever you wish to call it, in Peel Region. So what that is all the inspectors from those agencies will go into those places and ask those questions: screenings, masks, policies, those kinds of things, and then typically report that information back to a central database so that we can share that information with public health agencies to say, okay, this region or this area may have lower compliance to those things, and we may need to focus our resources a little bit differently than where we have in the past. The other thing is the employment standards officers with the Ministry of Labor. As you can well imagine, that some of the employment standard complaint bases over the last 18 months have slowed down significantly. Not to say that they're all gone, but they're just not as prevalent as they used to be. And most of those officers are out educating, right? Going into businesses, providing you information, providing you links and guidance and materials. And then any issues or problems that those officers happen to find will be funneled back up to the appropriate agency to deal with. So if you guys have other questions, let me know in the chat. I can get whoever to provide you my email address and phone number, and you can give me a call and we can chat anytime. That's basically, why I was here and why I wanted to present in this. And I apologize that I didn't have a big fancy presentation. But again, I want to reiterate that the Ministry of Labor around this particular subject doesn't have a lot to say around it now. With that being said, that will probably change as we move up and get into the other parts of the ROA legislation, especially looking at what they call the exit or the off-ramp part of it. But we're not there yet. So I just want to bring that perspective from the enforcement agency.
If I could just speak to that as well, Kevin, I thank you very much for that. And I think that it's really in line and congruent with our message out to our clients as well. It's like, don't worry about an inspection. When we go and help them, the ministry's there. And again, consider being named an expert from experience and so on. No one knows everything. No one. But having the resources to be able to go out to you, to ask questions, we do it. We don't want to give misinformation as well. You're out there, you're there. We're all learning together. And I have found the Ministry of Labor to be a great resource, and say to my team and clients, do everything reasonable that you can. Ask them, they'll guide you. If you don't have your own HR department and you don't outsource, you have resources out there that you can utilize. So I think that's really awesome. And I think that just a suggestion is when you have your team, that approachability is so important, because most people want to do things right. And they want to be in that position. And then with employees, what we do in part of our program is that we make sure everything that they need to know that they might have to answer the Ministry of Labor is on an actual job site board or workplace board, so that because we do our annual trainings, we do everything with our clients and all of that, but you do forget. It's a lot of information jam-packed really quickly. If they can go over to that and point it out and then go and demonstrate the work, it's such a different atmosphere in those workplaces. So just a bit of experience being in the field on the ground, yesterday wearing my full PPE, my hard hat and out, and today doing something different, just giving you my experience in the region.
Just one quick question about the all hands on deck thing, Kevin. So if like when you do that kind of a blitz, if you will, are the businesses notified ahead of time that somebody's coming?
Generally, for the multi-ministry teams, they would be, yes.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Not like a regular inspection where the Ministry of Labor can come on at any time and come in to do an inspection. Correct, Kevin?
Yes, correct. This is in addition to our regular duties that we've committed, all the agencies, enforcement agencies have committed to being all hands on deck to help control and stop the spread of COVID, or at least minimize it to the point where we're not having a situation like Alberta or Saskatchewan, right? So rather than go down that road, we're taking a more cautious approach, but not. I like your approach, Deborah. Not with a big stick. We're not coming in there to fine or prosecute you. We're coming in to educate and help, and we're leveraging our resources in those agencies to be able to do that in a non 8 to 5 Monday to Friday kind of thing, right? So some businesses may not be open at the same time that the Ministry of Labor inspectors are working. So that's why we try to get out on these after hours things.
Great. Okay, so I've been asked several times whether the actual slides and like what's going to be provided after the event. We definitely are going to be sending an email. The county will send an email to everyone who attended with links, and also a link to the recording, so you can definitely review the recording afterwards. We are going to speak to the presenters to see what in terms of slides can be provided. I don't really have a complete answer for that yet, but we'll let you know. I think the most important thing, though, is that our presenters have all offered to share their contact information. So if you would like to contact them directly, you definitely have that option. And I can tell by how generous they've been with their time and attention in preparing this presentation that they would welcome that. They would welcome the opportunity to hear from you. So I think we're going to wrap up now, actually. I don't see anything new in the chat, just some nice comments, which is great. Thank you. I want to thank you all for attending. A couple of things to note before we close the session. As I said, a survey also will be sent out by email along with the recording of the session after the event. Please watch for it and let us know what you think. We really do pay attention to those surveys and the feedback that we get. If you're interested in hearing from more experts, there are a series of recordings that you can access. Information about the series can be found at simcoe.ca/ask-an-expert. Thank you again to Pamela, Kevin, and Deborah for their time and insights today. Thank you to Wendy and Hannah for helping out on the back end and pointing out questions to me. And thank you to the County of Simcoe and all of the partners involved. I want to wish you all a fantastic rest of the day, a fantastic rest of the week, and a wonderful Thanksgiving weekend.